All right, I want to start this morning by expressing how thankful I am for all of you and the excitement that you've shown and the attitude that you've shown throughout all of this. It's a difficult time for all of us, and it's hard and challenging to be able to meet through this means of Zoom. However, I appreciate your positivity throughout all of this and the things heard about what you guys are doing and checking up on each other and finding ways to spend time together. It's just exciting. And it's some places, other places I've heard about aren't doing as much. They aren't being as excited. They aren't putting as many additional studies or having positivity during this time of trials. And so at the end of the day, there's two types of churches that we could choose to be. We could be excited about God and about the work that He's doing, no matter the circumstances, or we could become complacent. And if we become complacent, we would start to die. So I believe you all are the first kind of people there, that we are excited about our worshiping of God, our service to God, and we consider the kind of life that we are living to be given to God, each individually and also as a congregation. And that's what I want to talk about today in Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12 has been our theme for the year. I'm going to pull up on the screen the New King James Version of verses 1 and 2. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. It says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. There in that passage, we see that there's this calling. There's this urge to truly appreciate what God has done for us, all the mercies that God has given to us. And because of this appreciation, we care so much for that we are willing to entirely give up ourselves for God and to God and become living sacrifices to Him. And we've been taking our themes for the year, for each month, from verses 9 through 21. And hopefully you've been reading through that each week, and that way these are familiar in your mind. And as I've mentioned, I've been taking these lessons, taking notes on a series of sermons done by Andy Cantrell, and I've been restudying those sermons, editing it for this congregation, but then pretty much sticking pretty close to his outlines for this because I think it's an effective way that he's presented it. However, for this month, April, we're going to be talking about verse 11. And what Andy Cantrell did with it was broke it into two sermons throughout the month. And so my original plan, my intention was to merge these two back into one lesson, which was easier to do when I was merging two 45-minute lessons into a 45-minute lesson. Now that I'm merging two 45-minute lessons into a shorter lesson for the Zoom, that was going to be a challenge. And also, when I went over this lesson, I realized this is something I think is really important for us to really think about. And so I decided I'm going to slow down and go ahead and keep these in two lessons this month. And I'm just going to resign myself to 2020 not being a year of keeping to plans and schedules as they were originally made. So this month, the topic is going to come from verse 11 of Romans chapter 12. And I want to read that as we get going here. Verse 11 of Romans 12 says, not lagging behind in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. This verse provides three challenges that we need to ask ourselves where we're at. First, we need to ask ourselves, are we lagging behind in diligence? Are you lagging behind in diligence? And then we need to ask, are we fervent in spirit? And finally, are you serving the Lord? There's a range of people here, and some, they just want to do the minimum. Some, they just want to hop on and show their face for a bit, show their voice, and say, well, I've done my part, so stop talking about becoming a living sacrifice, because that's just getting old. But then there are some of you who every time we talk about becoming a living sacrifice, you think to yourself and decide, I need to do more. And typically those people who decide that they need to do more are those who are already doing the most out of any of us. But it's hard to be honest about ourselves and what we really are. But I challenge each of you to really consider for yourselves where you are on each of these ideas and where you can improve. And I know I'm doing the same throughout this series, and I hope you are as well, that we're considering where we're lacking and where we can improve. So today's lesson is going to focus on the idea of not lagging behind in diligence. And then in 2 weeks, we'll come back and talk about the idea of being fervent in spirit. And I'm not going to do an extra lesson on the idea of serving the Lord, because that kind of is fulfilled in both of these ideas and really throughout all of these concepts we've been talking about in Romans 12 of being servants to the Lord. So we're going to talk about today, fervent in spirit, or rather today, not lagging behind in diligence, and in a couple of weeks, the idea of fervent in spirit. So lagging behind. The idea of lagging, think about that word there for a second, lagging behind, or your translation may say sluggish or slothful. This word kind of has the idea of being something that's difficult or grievous, something that slows you down. And what does this look like? I want you to think about in your mind what this illustration of lagging behind looks like. And if anyone's has been a parent of teenage boys, you probably have a pretty good idea of what this idea of lagging behind looks like, what this idea of sluggish looks like, what it means to have to pull someone out of bed and get them to get to work. Bosses understand this illustration when they have employees that they've seen dragging their feet to accomplish anything. Maybe you've been on a sports team or a coach to a sports team, and you understand who it is in the group that is lagging behind, that is falling behind everyone else, is being slothful. So we all understand what it looks like for an individual to lag behind, or for a group of people to be slothful and to be lagging behind everyone else. And so what does it look, though, for a church to be lagging behind in something? And that's what I want to ask today. What does it mean to be a church? And for some of you, you'll immediately understand this illustration. You'll say, yes, I've seen people who are lagging behind, and so you understand what this looks like in a church. And that's because you spend all your time running as fast as you can toward Christ, and you're constantly having to pull others to keep them up with you, to encourage them to keep up in this race. But others, you may not understand what this looks like for a church to be lagging behind, for someone in a church to be lagging behind. Why you don't understand that illustration is probably because you are the one lagging behind. You are the one at the back, and there's no one behind you. Everyone else is in front of you. And if that's the case, then this is especially useful for you, but I think this is helpful in this idea of lagging behind for all of us. But it's not just lagging behind, it's lagging behind in the idea of diligence. So let's think about this word diligence for a second. And the word diligence that is used there in the Greek in the book of Romans is the word that we probably get our English word speed from. And so this idea of diligence has to do with the idea of haste, of earnestness in accomplishing or striving after something. It can do with both two main ideas, speed and also effort. And these two ideas of speed and effort, they go together, but they're not the same. We all can understand somebody that maybe they do things quickly. They're fast about what they do. They jump right on it. But when they're doing them, they don't do it very well. I know when working in fast food, there's coworkers that they did things really fast, but they didn't do it well. Or maybe there's people that do things really, really well, and they do it carefully and they put in hard work, but they don't do it fast. And it takes them a while to do it. And so the best in any craft, the best in any area are those who are good at both doing things fast and doing them well, working hard in it. And it's God's intention for us to get on the job immediately, to get going fastly and quickly, and to work without delay. However, to also work in an earnest, careful, and specific way about how we're doing his work. He wants us to do it well and to do it fast. A perfect example of what this looks like is found in Hebrews chapter 6. So turn over in your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 6. Hebrews chapter 6. We'll begin reading in verses 11 and 12. Hebrews 6, verse 11 and 12. It says, "And we desire that each one of you show the same diligence, so as to realize the full of assurance of hope until the end, so that you will not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises." So this passage here deals with both the ideas we just talked about. First, we have the idea of being diligent in verse 11, that we're diligent because we're reaching toward a certain goal, to certain goals, and he tells them to do that. But then in verse 12, He says that we need not to be sluggish. We need not to be slowing down, to be lagging behind, if you will, in what we're doing. So the question is, what in here in context is the thing that they were being supposed to be striving towards, the thing that they were supposed to be not sluggish about? And I want to suggest 4 things, and we've been going through the book of Hebrews, so I think you'll understand the context on these. But 4 things that they were supposed to be striving towards diligently, and that they were to not be sluggish in. First off, in chapter 5, verses 11 through 14, we see that he even calls them that they're being sluggish in their understanding, or your translation may say dull of hearing. And what they were doing was they weren't knowing enough. And even what they did know, they were being slow and not careful about it, so that they were losing that and becoming immature. We need to be careful not to be dull of hearing or sluggish in our understanding. Many of us need more diligence in this area. We need to spend more time reading God's word. We need to spend more time studying it, more time prepping for Bible classes, more efforts when we are listening, when we are reading, to paying attention to what we are reading, to paying attention to what is being said in the sermons, in the studies, maybe taking notes, giving more effort to earnestly learning from God. So that's one area. Another area in the book of Hebrews is found in chapter 6 and verse 1, where they had these goals. They had to find goals for growth. Specifically, it says that they were to press on to maturity. We need to find ways to keep growing, and we need to be earnest and diligent in that. Third, in their service, chapter 6 and verse 10, and we'll come back to that in a second, but it talks about their service to the Lord, how they need to be striving in that. And then finally, in their patiently enduring through trials. Chapter 10, and we're about to get into that on the Wednesday night studies of chapter 10. Well, it'll talk about all the things that they are going through during that time and how they had to be enduring these things, and they needed to be able to do so with diligence. Let's turn back to chapter 6 and verse 10. Let's go back to that and look about chapter 6 and verse 10 of Hebrews. It says, "For God is not unjust so as to forget your work and the love which you have shown toward his name, and having ministered and still ministering to the saints." This is a powerful passage. And really, when many of us read this, we think about the time that we've worked for the Lord, the effort and energy that we put in. And it says that God's not going to forget our work. And many of us are having a sigh of relief. This is encouraging. But for others, this idea doesn't make any sense. And why this idea is foreign to others is because you may be thinking, I know that I'm not doing some of this. Or maybe I know that I'm not doing much of this. After all, isn't this, it says ministering to the saints. So isn't this passage just talking to some preachers or ministers or evangelists? And the answer is no. This passage, he's writing to Christians. All of us, all Christians, should be ministering to the saints. And we're going to be remembered for the work that we do for the Lord. The next verse, in verse 11, says, "We desire that each one of you show the same diligence so as to realize the full assurance of hope until the end." It says that we show the same diligence. Let's think about that for a second, because the real challenge for us as a congregation, and here's the test, can we pick a level of diligence that for this congregation so that every member here, everyone could work on the same level of diligence? All of our diligence amounts to the same amount of work as shown by every member in the congregation. Can we pick a standard and say, hey, everyone in the congregation agrees to it, and this is what we're going to work towards on our level of diligence? Who would volunteer to be that standard for us to follow? Can I pick who that would be? Would that be okay for me to pick who the standard is, and the rest of us agree that we're going to follow this standard of diligence? Maybe I'll just pull out of a hat. I'll put everyone's name in a hat and ruffle it around and pull out somebody's name, and whoever's name I pull out, that's going to be the level of diligence that we all strive to meet. What happens if I pull out your name? How would we do? If I pull out your name and the rest of the congregation looks to you and says, that's the amount of diligence that we're going to put toward the work of the Lord, and we're all going to strive to that same amount of diligence, how would our congregation do? And does that scare you? Does that make you feel uncomfortable thinking about people looking to you as the standard of diligence and to strive to that same standard of diligence? It should. Because I think all of us know of ways and areas that we could do more. We could show more diligence. And I'm thinking about many ways right now that I could show more diligence, things that I could do more. And I hope that you right now are thinking about ways that you could show more diligence, that you could do more. Because we all lag behind in our diligence from time to time. And maybe you are currently in a season of lagging behind. Or maybe you just got to work and you're realizing how much time you've wasted before, especially during this quarantine. I think some of us might be spending more time in study of God's word, more time reaching out and encouraging others. And maybe you're realizing I wasted so much time before that I could have spent encouraging, working, and studying for the Lord. And so I want to ask the question, since we all struggle with this in our diligence and we need to work on it, what is it that makes me not be diligent sometimes? What is it that gets in the way of me being diligent for the Lord? So I'm going to present 5 simple answers to this question of what gets in our way of being diligent for the Lord. And we'll talk about each one in turn. So first, the first reason why we may not be diligent is because we forget the goal. We're not diligent because we forget what we're reaching toward. Turn over to 2 Peter chapter 1. 2 Peter chapter 1. In 2 Peter chapter 1, we'll begin reading in verse 5. It says, "Now for this very reason also, applying all diligence, in your faith supply moral excellence, and in your moral excellence knowledge, and in your knowledge self-control, and in your self-control perseverance, and in your perseverance godliness, and in your godliness brotherly kindness, and in your brotherly kindness love." Notice that verse 5, the reason that we're building all of these things, it says, "Now for this very reason also." What reason is that? Why are we working on all these things and being diligent to grow in this? Well, that's found in the verse previous, in verse 4. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 4. The reason that we're growing, the reason that we apply all diligence is, "For by these," verse 4 says, "he has granted to us his precious and magnificent promises, so that by them you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is found in the world by lust." Our goal, what we're striving toward, is to become partakers of that divine nature, to be more and more like the image of the God who has created us. You know, when we set our mind on that goal, that's amazing. And when in our life and people are doing things and there's a prize that is a lousy prize that is set, there's a goal that we just don't really care for, people don't work hard to win it. People don't work hard to finish. But if there is this big, amazing prize that is set for some competition, it's amazing what people will do in order to win that prize. They'll do whatever it takes. I'm thinking about game shows. A lot of game shows will set these amazing, expensive prices, and the people on it will do ridiculous things in order to do anything it takes to get that prize. I mentioned last week we've been watching the Amazing Race, and they set $1 million for the winners of that. And the people do outrageous things to be able to achieve that. Andy Cantrell, when he gave his lesson, gave the example of Wipeout. And maybe you're familiar with the show Wipeout. And what that show is basically they're going through this obstacle course, and they're supposed to be getting knocked flying all over. They're having to wipe out over and over. And the commentators are just making fun of them and laughing at them this whole time. But they keep getting back up. No matter how they get knocked down, no matter how much pain they're in, they keep getting back up and keep trying to get to the end of it, because there's a good prize there at the end, at the very least for pride. And maybe one show I like watching and have met some of the people that are on it, but is American Ninja Warrior. This American Ninja Warrior, maybe you've seen it, is a extreme obstacle course. The people work hard. They condition themselves all year so that they're able to do it. They go through anything they can to accomplish and to finish this task, because at the end, there's an amazing prize. Let's think about this back in the Bible. There is an amazing prize. There is an amazing goal for serving God. And so we should be willing, just like these people in these game shows, to do anything it takes to have all diligence to reach that goal, to reach that prize. So if I ever lack diligence, I need to be reminded of this goal. But in 1 Peter chapter 1, or sorry, 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 11, there's another goal mentioned for that we are reaching to attain. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 11 says, "For in this way, the entrance into the eternal kingdom of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ will be abundantly supplied to you." The goal that we're reaching, what we are running toward, is heaven, is that eternal kingdom. And so if we ever, sorry, I went too far. If we ever forget, if we are ever lagging in diligence, we need to be reminded of this goal, of what we are running toward. But not just what we are running toward. We need to be reminded, and this is the second reason why we sometimes forget to be diligent, is that we forget where we started. We need to pay attention to what we're running toward, but also what we are running from. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verses 4 and 9 tell us what we're running from, where we've come from. In verse 4 of 2 Peter chapter 1, it says, "For by these he has granted to us his precious and magnificent promises, so that by them you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world by lust." In verse 9 it says, "For he who lacks these qualities is blind or short-sighted, having forgotten his purification from his former sins." Where we've come from is a captivity in sin. Where we've come from is the corruption that is in this world by lust. Notice the word given there in verse 4, the word escape. If you put in your mind some illustration of this word escape, maybe you're seeing some movie where they had to escape from something, and maybe they're in some prison, maybe they're in some horrible situation, and they finally get out, they break out of it, and they escape from that. Imagine what they're doing as they get out. As soon as they get out, they just kind of stroll away, and they just walk away. As soon as they get out of that jail cell or whatever, they just kind of stroll away like nothing happened? No, that would be ridiculous. They are running as fast as they can because they realize that there's a captor that is trying to capture them. We need to realize that there is a vicious, a vile, and a scary captor that is trying to recapture us to bring us back into sin. And if we realize that, then we're going to run. If we remember what we've escaped from, then we are going to run as fast as we can away from that. And sometimes when people run the fastest, maybe the fastest you've run in your life is when you were a kid and you're in the backyard and there was something out of the darkness, out of the shadows, maybe it's in the evening, that was trying to eat you. And some imaginary thing that was chasing you, and you ran the fastest you ever have in your life. But today, the things we are running from are not imaginary. What we are running from, what we've escaped from, is not just something that's in our head. It is real and it is terrifying. We've got to be running from something, and we need to run as fast as we can. So if I lag behind in my diligence, I need to remember what I'm running from and also where I'm running to. The third reason why we sometimes lag behind in our diligence is found in Hebrews chapter 10. So turn over to Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 36. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 36. And I want you to put, I want you to put your name in here. I'm going to put my name in as I read it, but I want you to put your name in this text as it says, "For Cameron Piner has need of endurance, so that when Cameron Piner has done the will of God, Cameron may receive what was promised." Put your name in there, because we all have need of endurance, because we get tired at times. We get tired when we're running, and we need endurance. Because of all this running that we've been doing, running to God, running away from Satan, maybe the illustrations throughout the Bible where it talks about being a soldier or running in a race, we get tired sometimes. And sometimes when I get tired, when I am running and I run out of endurance, I need to be reminded that Jesus says I have a need of endurance. I need my teammates that are running along beside me whenever I get tired to tell me, I understand that you need to catch your breath, but catch your breath and keep up. Maybe Matthew could tell us more about this idea of running in a race and how we may get tired, and others along us and those on the sidelines encouraging us, keep going. You may be tired, but at the end, you can find rest. And notice here what they've been running through, what they've been going through during the situation. To go back to verse 32 of Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10, beginning verse 32. It says, "But remember the former days when after being enlightened, you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. For you showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession and a lasting one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised." Do you relate to the situation in verse 32 and 33 at all? Does this sound familiar, maybe in your walk with God? Think back to when you first became a Christian. Can you remember that the time when you first became a Christian? Now, some of the people here, you can't participate in this exercise we're about to do because you aren't a Christian. You haven't started that journey. And so first, do you remember those that are a Christian? Do you remember the excitement when you first became a Christian? And that excitement that you had at first, and then you went back to work, and people looked at you weird. And you went back into the community or whatever, or maybe even among those that you were friends with, and they looked at you weird. They said mean things to you. And at first, just like the Hebrews, you were excited about that, about being a Christian, and you were excited that you were able to suffer for Christ. And it didn't bother you about what people said about you. But then they kept doing it. And the constant presence of others, the constant pressure brought on by others, eventually shut you up. And you remember that? You have need of endurance. When people keep on coming on to us, this isn't just some sprint where we get excited, we become a Christian, and we sprint to the finish and we're done. This is a long race. And we need to remember that during this, sometimes we get tired, but we have need of endurance. The fourth reason that we sometimes we lag behind and we lose our diligence is because we get sidetracked, because we get distracted. Turn to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1, it says, "Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." Notice here that sometimes it mentions that we get tangled up. But notice it says every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. These are two different things. Sometimes I get sidetracked. Sometimes I get distracted by things that aren't a sin. The things that I wouldn't typically define as being a sin are what becomes encumbrances to me. Jesus talks about those things in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 22. Matthew chapter 13 and verse 22, Jesus is giving this illustration of sowing the seed, and he talks about the thorns that come up and choke him out. And verse 22 says, "And the one on whom the seed was sown among the thorns, this is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful." Jesus defines that thorns that choke out our Christian life. What chokes us out, he says, is the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth. You know what that is? In other words, Jesus is saying what chokes out the word is your job, is your family, is your hobbies, which many of us are diligent about. But let me be clear. I don't want this to get taken wrong. Let me be clear. For most of us, the way we go about our jobs, the way we care for our family, the way we care for our friends, that is how we are being diligent in our service to God. And so just because we're focusing on those things doesn't mean that we're becoming entangled. However, you know as well as I do that there is a difference between being diligent in our job, a difference between being diligent in our family and with our friends, with anything else, for the purpose of glorifying God and bringing others to him, or Just being diligent in those things because I enjoy them, because I want to do them, because I find purpose in them. And then we say, oh yeah, I'm doing this and this is glorifying God as a side effect. But that's when these things are becoming entangling to us and we get distracted. I think we can all understand the illustration of a kid playing sports. Maybe we've seen videos, maybe we've seen kids. They're especially little ones, they're playing in a sport and they get distracted. They're maybe going to go kick a soccer ball or in baseball. My older brother was always very distracted in baseball. He is out in the middle field, out in this middle of the outfield, and he wasn't paying attention. He didn't know what was going on. He didn't know what he was supposed to be doing. He didn't care about baseball. He got distracted. But sometimes I get distracted. Sometimes we adults, not just kids, we get distracted by the things around us. Sometimes I forget what the point is. I forget what I'm doing, and I begin to get entangled by the stuff that slows me down. Sometimes I get sidetracked. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 4. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 4 says, no soldier in active service entangles himself in the affairs of everyday life, so that he may please the one who enlisted him as a soldier. Notice here what Paul told Timothy. He says, if you're a soldier and you're in active duty, you're not going to entangle yourself in the affairs of just everyday life. We are either in the army of God, we are either in the army of God or we are not. And we need to decide that. And if we are in the army of God, then we must not lag behind in diligence. So far we've talked about 4 reasons why we might lag behind in diligence. And all of these have been mostly understandable. They've been reasons that we understand getting distracted. But at the end of the day, they're all just excuses. 1, we might forget the goal, and so we lag behind in diligence. 2, we might forget where we came from. We might get tired, and we might get distracted from following God. And that's reasons why we might lag behind in diligence. And maybe one of those is what it is for you. But Jesus gave the hardest reason hardest reason to swallow about why we might be lagging behind in our diligence. In Matthew chapter 25 and verse 26, Jesus really hit it hard when he said the reason that we might get distracted, well, we might lag behind. In Matthew chapter 25 and verse 26, Jesus says, but his master answered and said to him, you wicked, lazy slave. You knew that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I scattered no seed. This is during a parable where Jesus is telling about giving, this master giving to his servants this money, these talents, and saying, do something with them. And some did stuff with them, and this one did not. And what he said to the slave is he said, you wicked, lazy slave. So what reason is it for you right now that you're lagging behind in diligence? Is it excuses 1 through 4? Is it just that you forgot where you came from, forgot where you're going, you got tired, or maybe you just got distracted, or maybe I'm just lazy. Maybe I'm just selfish. Maybe I just care about me and about my life and about my world and about my kingdom, and that's what's going to come first. Or have I changed my thinking to realize that this is not my world, but it's God's world. It's not my life, but it's God's life that he has purchased with a price, and I am not my own. And if I don't remember to be diligent in my service to God, then when I stand before God, he won't say, well done, now have rest. He will say, you have been lazy and wicked. Now, I've been every one of those things before, and I think you probably have too. On any given day, it might be one or the other that I've forgotten, or the reason that I'm falling behind in my diligence. On any given day, I need diligence, I need endurance, and I cannot just be lagging behind. So what needs to change? What needs to change in order for me to be more diligent, to not be lag behind in diligence? Romans chapter 12 and verse 2. Back to our theme passage there in Romans 12. Verse 2 says, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. Here in America, the pattern, the culture is to be lazy. People here are just lazy. They're not hardworking, and they're sluggish, and that's normal. Now, obviously, there's some exceptions to that. There are some people that they really are hardworking. They're diligent people, and they stand out in their field, and they shine. But the reason they stand out and they shine is because we live in a culture where most people are lazy. And the Romans chapter 12 tells us to not conform to this world. Don't be lazy like them. But it also tells us to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. Now, throughout this lesson, I give you 5 ways that we need to change our thinking. 5 ways that we can renew our mind. First, we need to renew our mind about where you are headed. We need to renew our mind about where you've come from. 3, we need to renew our mind about being tired. 4, we need to renew our mind to avoid distractions. And finally, we need to renew our mind about what it means to be wicked and lazy. Back up to verse 3, or number 3. Renewing our mind about being tired. Sometimes we can work hard and we're tired and we feel good about it. I don't know about you, but when you go through and work really hard on something, afterwards you feel good. Maybe it's been working out, maybe it's been accomplishing something in your house, or accomplishing some task for work. When you finish it, you feel good about yourself. You feel good about being tired. We need to renew our mind about being tired. And then we need to renew our mind about avoiding distractions and about what it means to be wicked and lazy. Finally, and I was only going to include this part if we had time, and we're kind of at the time limit, but I want to include this anyway because I think this is helpful. There's a story of the battle, and this is a historical story of the Battle of Marathon, and maybe your history buffs then will recognize the story. But there's a battle that happened back in 490 BC, and this battle involves Darius, who is in the Bible, but Darius, as we often call him. And this guy, he got irritated with the Greeks, and so he sent an army to destroy Athens. And the Athenians heard that they were coming out to destroy them, and so they went out to meet them at this place called Marathon. And this place, Marathon, was located about 24 miles from Athens. It's what we get our modern idea of marathons from, but they got the distance there wrong. But 24 miles from Athens away. And that's where they met them. But the Persians, they were better armed. They were better trained. And so the Athenians, they blocked the path. They cut down trees, and they blocked the path in such a way that the Persians could not enter. They couldn't pass the trees. But the Athenians, whenever they were ready, they could walk out from behind the trees, and they could go fight. But the Persians, they were confident that the Athenians would never come out from behind those trees. They were confident that that was never going to happen. But there was one Athenian who was diligent. There was one Athenian who knew how the Persians fought. And he suggested that what they should do, what the Athenians should do, is put all their weak men in the middle and put their strong men, their strong soldiers, on the ends of the line. And that's just totally different from what anyone in that time would do in battle. What you're supposed to do is you put your strong ones in the middle so they don't get broken up, and you put the weak ones on the end. But they flipped that. And their plan was that when they went through, the Persians would just immediately bust through their line there in the middle. And they would think that they bust through so fast that they won. But then the strong Athenians would come at the Persians from behind and defeat them. And this plan worked exactly as planned. And they slaughtered the Persians. And this fight went on for some days, and they were without sleep and without rest. And the Persians, they fled back to their boat. But when they got back to their boat, they realized that the city of Athens had no soldiers there, because all the soldiers of Athens were there in Marathon. And so the boats got up, and they sailed to Athens to go and conquer the city that had no soldiers. And the Athenians, they were tired. They were bleeding. They were dying. But yet they realized that they had to get back to their city because their loved ones, their homeland, was in danger. And so while some people stayed with the baggage and with the captives, the rest of them, they ran as fast as they could this 24 miles back from Marathon to Athens in full armor. And many of them were dying along the way. Some of them probably looked to the right and the left, and they saw their friends growing tired and exhausted and falling down dead. And they may have thought, if I keep running, then I also am going to fall down and die. But still, they kept on running. In fact, they ended up beating the ships back to Athens, and they propped themselves up on their swords and on their shields, and they waited for the ships to arrive. When the ships of the Persians arrived, and they saw an army standing there waiting for them. And when they saw this army of Athenians, and they saw the resolve of the Athenians, they never even parked their boats. They went back home to Persia. Imagine what it would be like if we Christians, in our fight for the Lord, had the same kind of diligence that these Athenians had. Imagine if we were willing to run as fast as we can to fight for God, to fight for those that we love. Imagine if we were willing to have this diligence in the spread of the gospel. Imagine if we had this diligence of the Athenians in the battle of the Lord. Just imagine what we would accomplish for God. That's the kind of diligence that we should be working toward. Now, today we've talked about some reasons you may be lagging in your diligence. We've talked about the need for the diligence, and that we need to all be working together to keep each other in this race, to keep each other in this fight, to have diligence in the work for the Lord. Maybe you are struggling with that. Maybe there is something that you are struggling with today you need help with. You need your fellow Christians, you need your fellow soldiers to say that they've got your back and to help you, to drag you along in this fight. Let us know. Maybe you haven't started this walk with God. Maybe you aren't a Christian. Don't wait. As I said the past couple of weeks, we will help you during this time. You don't have to wait for things to go back to normal. If you need to be baptized today, we will baptize you today. Don't wait any longer. But if we can help you in any way, then give me a call. Give the elders a call. Let someone know and find that help and that prayers that you need.